Welcome back. So we're going to continue our conversation about completing the square in this video. Now we're going to use completing the square a little bit differently. So if you notice, our learning target is just slightly different from what we talked about in the previous video. Today we're going to use it to rewrite equations, to rewrite quadratic equations. Now before we do that, I do want to take a moment and I want to review what we've done so far. Okay? So to solve by completing the square, solve means you're getting a number answer, okay? That's something I noticed a lot of kids made a mistake on the test, is when they got to these two questions, they lost track of what they were doing. Should they be solving for a number? Should they be solving an equation? So remember, solve means number. You should be getting a number for a solution, okay? I need you to remember that. So what was our first step? Well, the first step is we need the x squared term to not have any coefficients. So remember, when there's a negative in front of it, I'm just going to divide everything by -1. It's going to flip the signs of everything, but then it's by itself, so we can do our process. Our first step is to move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to add my constant to the other side of my equation. Second step, I take that b, so b over 2 squared, so 2 squared or 4, I add that to both sides of my equation. And then I'm going to clean up that equation into that. Then remember the third step. The third step is factor what you have there. So we end up with that. And then if you factor properly, you always get two of the same thing. So you always want to write it like so. When you rewrite it like that, then solving begins with taking the square root of both sides. So square roots undo the square. I subtract that 2 over. Oh, I'm sorry, and I forgot the plus or minuses along the way, because you always want your two solutions. Very, very important. And then remember, when you can, you always want to simplify that radical. So remember, 20 splits up into 4 and 5. So your answer, square root of 4 is 2, and you keep the square root of 5. And that is going to be your answer. All right? So there's our 4-step process for getting that done. Now, we can also use completing the square to put a standard form quadratic into its vertex form. So that's going to be my next task here, is I'm going to convert this standard form equation into vertex form. Now the steps are pretty similar, however, just ever so slightly different. So I'm going to start with that b over 2 squared. So I take that 10, b over 2 squared is 5 squared or 25. All right, so right away, I'm going to add that to both sides of my equation. Now, notice how I'm isolating that section that I added, okay? So I still put it on both sides, but I'm isolating what I added with the x's. Now the reason I'm doing that is because my next term or my next step is to factor. That factors to x plus 5 x plus 5. And again, when you do this right, you should always, always get the same thing twice. So that'll be x plus 5 squared. But now for equations, you want the y by itself, right? We can't just leave it like this. So I'm going to minus that 25. Negative 1 minus 25 will leave me with a minus 26. So it's a pretty similar process, okay? You still use that b over 2 squared. You add that to both sides. You end up factoring. But this time, make sure you note you're getting an equation, and you're leaving it as an equation with y by itself, all right? So let's try 2 more of these before I let you go with this video. So our first step, okay, is identify that b over 2 squared. Negative 4 squared equals 16. So I'm going to add that to both sides of my equation. But when I do, I'm going to make sure to isolate it there away from the number that was already with the equation. I isolate it because that can be factored. So my second step, remember, is factoring that beast. And this is going to factor to x minus 4, x minus 4. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the factoring anymore because I'm hoping you have that down. Two things that multiply to negative 16 and add to negative 8. And when you do this right, you should always get 2 of the same thing. So I'm going to write it as such. Oops, that should be a 16. I'm sorry. And then the final step is you still want y by itself. So I'm going to subtract that 16 from both sides. And there is my answer. All right. So let's do one more together. So again, step number 1. Need to identify that b over 2 squared. So negative 3 squared is 9. I'm going to add that to both sides of my equation, just like always. But when I do that, I'm going to isolate it, okay? I'm going to isolate that because that is going to be my part that factors. So then I need you to factor what's there as your second step. When you do, you should always get 2 of the same thing, so you can write it as the squared, okay? And finally, step number 3, which I realized I forgot to label over here. Oh. Step number 3, get the y by itself. So I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides. 7 minus 9 is a negative 2. And there you have it. So pretty dang similar to what we were doing yesterday, except this time we're getting an equation instead of getting a numerical answer. So remember I said that's why it's important to remember solve means you're getting a number. Rewriting an equation means you're ending with an equation. Okay? So remember those 2 things for me, please. That's going to be critical for you. Now, as always, please go and write your summary. And again, your summary could be talking about the difference between how we use completing the square. That'd be an awesome way. Discuss that learning target of ours. But please just make sure, take a little bit of time here, write that summary, and then come back to class ready to do your practice work.